Hey, what's up, guys? Warframe is one of those games that can be extremely overwhelming. I want to share a couple things with you guys to hopefully make your experience a tiny bit better. I've been playing Warframe for about 300 hours now, still learning new things every day. I have quests left untouched, frames left unplayed, weapons not acquired, and even things like raids and eidolons not even completed. The game itself, I kind of consider like a shooter looter. That's somewhat like Pokemon. You collect frames, weapons, make them pretty, and use those frames and weapons to get more frames and weapons. This video itself, I'm going to show mostly just about the Warframes. The Warframes themselves, they play a big part in how you play the actual game. Starting off, you can choose between frames like Excalibur, Mag, and Volt. These guys have a couple different starting stats that vary. Typically you'll see stats listed here like armor, energy, health, shield, and sprint speed. The generic value of all these are typically starting at around 100 of each, and 1.0 for your sprint speed. So if you do see something like a higher armor of 225, then typically you'll want to cater around that armor and increase using any armor mods that you might find. For somebody like Mag, who's one of the other starter frames, she has much less armor, less than the default 100. So you typically don't want to stack armor with her. She focuses mostly on energy and shield. And when it comes to Volt, he has next to no armor and a tiny bit of extra shield. Typically this is just kind of a main overview of all the characters. You do have kind of 6 ways to effectively survive. Armor is going to be the first, your shield is your second, your health is your third, crowd control, which basically means stopping the enemies from attacking you, is the fourth, running away would be the fifth, and killing things would be the final and sixth way. Each of these frames can be buffed by putting mods into slots. So if we go back over this way, you'll see here I have just the basic values for Excalibur, and over on the side we have our rank bonuses. So because my Excalibur right now is rank 20, he's getting an extra 30% energy, 140% health, and 140% shield. If I was to add a mod like Vitality onto him, then he will gain 440% health. The reason he gains 440% instead of a much higher value is because this Vitality only multiplies off the base value that you've seen in the previous screen. So his 100 health, 100 shield. The same thing happens for redirection. 400% of 100 should add 400 shield on, bringing me to 640. The next thing to mention would be your capacity bar. So up at the top you'll see there is a capacity of 40. When we add mods like Vitality on, they have a drain listed up at the top right. The next thing that's next to them is a polarity. So if I was to add Vitality onto just a basic slot, then it will knock 12 off of my capacity. When you see a little tiny slot listed on the side, that polarity basically will help decrease the overall capacity required to fit this mod. So if I insert it over here, it then only costs half the value. The next way to increase your capacity is to level up. So when you level up, you increase your capacity up until you hit rank 30. The next way is when you go down to your actions menu, you'll see an Orkin reactor slot. By doing this, you double up your mod capacity so that you can fit more mods onto your frame. Another way to fit more mods onto your frame would be having an aura. So if your aura matches the polarity that you see at the top, then you'll get even more capacity. By adding an aura, I'd typically get 7, but this one will grant me 14 because it matches. So this is the only slot that acts like that, and typically you have a couple of different effects that you can put into those slots. The other 8 slots can typically fit any mod that you see, but if you do put a mod into a slot that doesn't have matching polarity, then it will end up costing extra drain. So you do want to be careful on how you polarize your mod slots. So you can, once you reach rank 30, go through. I will show you using Equinox. So you can go down to actions and select polarize. By doing so, you can change the polarity of one of these slots to match with some of the mods that you plan on using. If I was to max out my primed flow that you kind of see faintly in the background, then I would bring that from a 12 down to a 6. If I was to do it with my overextended, that would bring that from basically that's a 12 down to a 6 as well. But if I was to max my primed flow, then I would get a tiny bit more value out of this one. So if I was to polarize Equinox again, I would do it with the little tiny minus or dash symbol that you see here, so that it matches with my flow to get the most value. The next thing I want to go over is with abilities. So you typically have 4 abilities listed on every single Warframe that you look at. You do have a couple of other abilities sometimes linked, like passive abilities. Equinox is a unique one that can somewhat have 7 or 8 because she has a day and night form. When looking at the passive ability, this is something that always occurs. You'll see Excalibur deals increased damage and attacks faster when wielding swords. So when using Excalibur, you mostly do want to use swords because you will grant him more damage. The next thing when looking at your abilities is kind of choosing which ability you want to focus around. Typically, Slash Dash, Radial Blind, Radial Javelin aren't often used. When people use Excalibur, most of the times they use the Exalted Blade ability. To make this ability better, you want to focus on damage. Sometimes you want to focus on range, but not so much. Your duration and energy per second. If I switch over to my Ember, the only important ability for Ember for me is World on Fire. So here I want range to be as high as possible, I want the damage to be as high as possible, and I want it to use as little energy per second as possible so that I can have it going at all times. So if I view stats with my mods on, then that drastically increases the range, it increases the damage, and decreases the energy per second used in order to have that ability up and running. So there's a kind of a big focus on which frame you want to use. Each frame has a couple different abilities that you'll typically focus around. Some frames have all useful abilities, so they might require a more balanced build where you want to typically increase your strength, range, efficiency, and duration. For Ember, because I mostly just use World on Fire, she doesn't need that much duration. Couple of things just to finish off the video that I do want to mention. If you are planning on purchasing any frames, a couple of great ones to purchase would be Necros Prime. One of his main abilities is increasing the amount of loot that you get. So his Desecrate ability grants you 54% extra loot. So each time an enemy gets killed, it desecrates his corpse and grants 54% extra loot. The next thing that can happen is that if a corpse gets cut in half by something like slash damage, then that counts as 2 separate bodies, and each of those have a chance at getting extra loot. So Necros is pretty cheap. You can find them on things like Warframe Market for anywhere like 80 platinum. So he's one of the better starter frames to look at. I personally use Nidus. He was able to clear every single planet for me, every single mission. He's one of the tankiest frames I found, and on top of that, one of the only ones with health regen. So because of that, he just overall fit the needs for pretty much every mission. When going back over to your mission menu, you will see a ton of different missions on the planets. So when you start off on Earth, if you're trying to choose between a couple different frames, you do have frames like Nidus who can do things like hijack very easily. So basically he kind of cheeses the mechanic because hijack uses the shield to make the vehicle get to the end. If you don't have a shield, it instead uses your health. So by doing so, Nidus is able to effectively make hijack very easy. You do have other frames that can do that as well. Ivera and Loki can do things like spy missions very easily. So they can basically kind of just stealth their way through and make the missions as easily as possible. To get Ivera, you do have to do spy missions. So you can either choose to purchase or get frames like Loki as well to make it easier. I use Ember typically to go through extermination missions, mostly for the reason that Ember moves very quickly and just kills everything on the way. You have a couple different options for defense, interception, excavation. Things like Frost or Gara are great to help out with those. And when you look at missions like capture or assassination, you can use Volt just because he runs extremely fast. As kind of a quick overview, that was most of the stuff I wanted to run through with the Warframes and some of their useful abilities and kind of a generic overview. I will kind of try to do a follow-up video and go through things like damage types and weapons next. Thanks.